Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this final podcast of 2023, I have tidbits, several works in progress, as well as some finished projects. I'll also be sharing a bit about some of the projects I'd like to tackle in 2024. As always, patterns, books, videos, etc., anything that I mention in the video will be down in the show notes. So let's get started. This first tidbit showed up in my email. The Knitting History Forum is hosting its annual conference with 6 papers being presented. The conference is on Saturday, February 3rd from 11:15 a.m. until 4:45 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So my time zone, which is U.S. Central Time, is 6 hours behind that, which means it starts at 5:15 a.m. my time. But the good news is that the event is being recorded. So even if you can't see the event live, you can watch it later. If you're not familiar with the Knitting History Forum, it is an international network for the history of knitting and crochet. The Knitting History Forum advances and promotes the history of knitting through research, exchange of ideas, and information, and by historical reconstruction. Examples of people who are highly involved with this organization are Sandy Black, who is the chair of the organization. She wrote this book here called Knitting Fashion Industry Craft. It's a really fabulous book. Jane Malcolm Davies, who has written several books related to Tudor clothing, like this one right here. This is the book that I used to knit the Tudor era stockings that is part of my long-term project to understand the evolution of hand knit stockings. And when I registered for the conference, it was her name on the email thanking me for registering. Jane has been highly influential in establishing knitting as a serious area of textile research. This book right here, which is the 2018 volume of Archaeological Textiles, established and defined the vocabulary in terms to be used when archaeological finds are discussed, and so that those terms could be used and understood by non-knitters. I will put links to these books down in the show notes. The archaeological textile book is available in hard copy format or as a digital download. The 6 papers to be presented are as follows. A royal waistcoat re-examined. So Charles I wore this silk knitted waistcoat or undershirt. Allegedly, he wore this on the scaffold at his execution. So this paper examines the provenance, the silk construction, the dyes, how the garment itself was constructed by comparing it to others from the similar time period, rather than what has been the focus of previous study, which were the stains that were on the front of it. Next is When There Are No Words, using reconstruction as a tool for understanding the creation of knitted liturgical gloves. So similar to my personal projects to understand the evolution of the stocking and socks by reconstructing them, or my previous project where I was knitting sweaters from each decade, they are doing something similar with these medieval liturgical gloves, which is examples of some of the earliest knitting that you could find in Europe. Next up is the fascinating corsness sweater. So these are traditional finished sweaters that combine knitting and crochet and are prized for their individual uniqueness. This next paper is about a specific person, and I was surprised that I'd actually heard of this person. The paper is The Lost Biography of Frances Lambert. So anyone who has looked at any 19th century manuals, whether hard copy or more likely digitized, Frances Lambert's name will come up. I know that I have at least one of her knitting books in my digital collection. This particular book is actually investigating who she was and what happened to her, because there had been so little known about her previously, but they were able to discover some new information that allows us to know more about Frances Lambert. After that, we've got Yarns for Knitting, the Influence of Twist. So this is an examination of spinning techniques, particularly tightly twisted singles that could be used in weaving, and how different that yarn construction is to the more loosely spun and plied yarns that we see today. So she compares the two types of yarns in knitted samples to show what would happen to the fabric. And finally, we've got Past and Present Knitters on Fair Isle, a case study of Fair Isle knitted fishermen's keps. So the author spent a year living on Fair Isle, designing and knitting fishermen's keps, which is another word for hats. There are far more in-depth descriptions of each of these talks available to read on the Knitting History Forum website, which I will leave a link to down below, as well as a link to the Eventbrite website where you can register for this event. There is a cost. It's 27 British pounds, which is about $34 US or 31 euros. As I mentioned, the event is being recorded and it's going to be available for viewing using a private password indefinitely, with the exception of the Fair Isle paper, which will only be available for 1 month. This tidbit showed up in my YouTube subscriptions a few weeks back. It's a video by Veritasium, who is a physics educator. In this video, he demonstrates how sewing machines work using really large-scale models that he created so that he can manipulate what the needle is doing and manipulate what's going on in the inside of the machine, so that's really understandable. He starts out by defining the problem that had to be solved, which was to pass the thread through the fabric from the top of the fabric and then turn and go back up through the fabric from the bottom without also having to make the needle take that path. He goes through the various approaches to solving this problem, along with the innovations and breakthroughs throughout the 19th century that gradually brought us to where we are today with sewing machines. It's a fascinating video, and I think you'll find it really interesting, even if you don't own a sewing machine. So this is the first thing I want to show you. It's called the Zipper Neck. It's by Petite Knit, and it's something that I wanted to knit in order to wear it underneath my winter coat when we go on our evening walks. Luckily, it's been really mild this December, like unbelievably mild, so I haven't needed this extra level of warmth yet, but I'm pretty confident Minnesota winter is truly going to come and I will need it. I just wanted something that would just keep this upper part of my body warmer, that a scarf really wasn't going to do. And I think this is really going to be a great answer to that problem. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you up close what this actually looks like. So I just finished this yesterday. I did all of the weaving in of the ends. There's a facing right here that I had to sew down, and I was ready to install the zipper. I kept, during the process of knitting this, kept looking at the different zippers that I bought to decide, which one would I be, okay with. None of them are thrilling, but this is going to be worn under a coat. Nobody's going to see it, but I did want something that looked pretty good. And I finally realized yesterday what the problem was with the zippers and why I didn't want to use any of them. So when you're, choosing things by color online, you can't always tell exactly if something's going to match. Even if you have a great screen, you never know if they capture the colors accurately or not. So these were the three colors that I chose. This one is like more red. I thought it would be more of a purpley color. So this didn't work. And I had chosen these two because I thought, well, the gray might work pretty well, might be pretty close. A lot of times if you have a darker color for things like thread or fastenings like this, they tend to hide in the shadows, so it's not as bad a deal. So I got these three colors and I put them into the opening. I'm like, I hate these. And I finally realized yesterday why this is a problem. Now I ordered these, like I said, online, and they had all these different choices. And when I was looking at the metal ones, I just naturally liked the brass ones. That was like the first choice. I could have chosen something different, but I just liked it, liked the way it looked. So I was focusing on the color of the, whatever these are called on each side, the ribbon or whatever you call it. The problem is that the two colors I'm working with here are this kind of, it's called Razzle Dazzle. It's kind of a raspberry color and gray. It's a silver mohair. And I have these gold zippers, and that looks terrible. And what I needed was something with a silver zipper stop and silver teeth. These are basically the same color choices I'm going to have online. I thought I would go to some places locally and see if I could get something better. I did go to Joann yesterday. There's nothing there that was going to work. And so this weekend I'll go to the fabric store in St. Paul, where I usually get vintage buttons for my knitted cardigans, and see if they have something better. It's kind of a higher end fabric store anyway. It's independently owned. It's not a big box store chain thing anyway. So this is almost done, but I wanted to let you see what this project was and what I've been working on. I'm really excited about it. It was fun to knit. This shaping method here of using, short rows for the neck shaping, very familiar with, combined with the increases every row to do the shoulder shaping was really interesting. And I've done this before with shoulder straps. This just isn't something I would have thought of doing, and I thought it was really clever. So back, I think it was close to the end of November, when I was working on the two little sweaters for my grandniece and grandnephew, and I was slowing down on my progress because I didn't want to finish them because I didn't know what I was going to knit next. So I started a whole bunch of projects, really thought through what I needed, what would be interesting to knit. Looked at my Ravelry queue, which I usually don't use as an actual queue. It's just like, I bought this, I really like it, someday I might want to knit it. And I pulled out the sweater called Royale, and I decided to start knitting that. So I knit the sleeve right away. And then I've been taking a break from it as I've been working on zipper neck and a few other things, some of which I'll be showing you very shortly, just to get myself having a variety of projects of different sizes and complexity so that I can go to knitting group and not have to worry about keeping track of something really complex. I started working on Royale again, the body this time. The pattern has you start with the sleeves. I don't usually do that, but I thought it was a good idea because of the stitch pattern complexity. It would be a good introduction to at least some of the stitch patterns, as well as confirm that I was getting the appropriate gauge and all of that kind of thing. So I did knit one sleeve first, and I'm knitting the body now, and then I will knit the second sleeve at the end, which I think is a really genius way to approach it, because I hate knitting two sleeves, one right after the other. It tends to be the boring part. So I might do this again in the future, as long as I'm making the sleeves separately from the body. I think this is a good idea. A lot of times I'll knit the body first, and then I will knit the sleeves, attach them, and knit top down. But in this case, they were knit bottom up. Anyway, let's go back to the overhead, and I will show you the progress on Royale. I started in November. I made the sleeve first, and that was a good way to really check gauge and get used to this panel. This is considered one panel. It's got 3 different cables in it, but it's one panel. And then the body of the sweater was going to have another panel. So you can see right here, this is the same panel that was on the sleeve, and it's on 2 parts here. And then there's this central panel here. This panel is like an 8-row repeat. This one is a 20-row repeat. And then there's like a twisted moss stitch on the side. So it's like a regular moss stitch, only the knits are twisted, because the knits are twisted everywhere in this. This color may look vaguely familiar to you, because it is the same color that I used for the zipper neck. This was combined with some silver silk mohair, and so it muted the color a bit, but it's the exact same yarn. When I ordered this yarn online, I was looking at all the different colors of Cascade 220, and I thought, oh, this is nice. And then when I opened the package, I thought, this looks very familiar, and I realized I had 4 skeins of this in my stash that I've had for years, but I didn't have enough of it to make this sweater. Even if I'd remembered it and liked it, it would be a different dye lot, whatever. So when I found zipper neck and I wanted to use that, I thought, well, I'm just going to use the old yarn that I've had in order to make this. It's obviously a color I like because I chose it twice without realizing it. So the way I like to work when I'm working with something that's got a lot of different cables, and especially something like this with these traveling twisted stitch patterns where you have crossings. In this case, it's every other round. A lot of times in traveling twisted stitch patterns, you have something crossing on every single round. So there's a lot to keep track of. And so it's important to be able to really read your knitting. They have similarities to them. That's why they were chosen for the same garment. Sometimes things are crossing to the left. Sometimes things are crossing to the right. And trying to keep track of all that and what you're supposed to do when can be tricky, especially when establishing the stitch patterns. Is I put markers in. I don't like them on the needles. I will have them on the needle for the first round and then I immediately move it to the fabric underneath. I just hate having markers on my needle. They just drive me crazy. They fall off, then I have to pick them up, or they fall off and I don't notice it, and then it's a disaster. And so for this, because there are these different panels, but there's multiple cables within the panel, I really wanted to keep track of where I was in the round as well as in each of the half rounds, because the front and the back are worked exactly the same. I have two colors of stitch markers here. I've got these kind of turquoisey ones and these orange ones. So the beginning of the round, I just hung on and I wanted it to be something that was obviously different than what the other markers were. So I hung two of them here, and in the middle of the round, I've got two green ones. And then between the panels, I had markers. So there's the filler stitch here, and then I have an orange marker, and then I have panel A, and then I have these two markers here, and panel B is between it, and then again I have panel A, and then I have the filler stitch. What this allows me to do is just kind of give a visual check of where am I in here. And when I'm reading my chart right here, I like a physical printed chart, and I use highlighter tape. I don't use an app on an iPad for that. I'm sitting in front of my computer. I don't want my iPad just constantly staying lit up. I just put this in front of me on my desk, and it helps me keep track of what row I'm on. So I can read my knitting and know what I'm doing, but I want to know exactly where I am in terms of increases or decreases. So I had some waist shaping where I was doing decreases, and now I'm in the place where I'm doing increases. And so I just make sure that I highlight that across from here, because if I'm focused on just this part here and I know how to work the filler stitch, I might not be paying attention to, oh, there's an increase. And so I use an actual highlighter to just mark where all of the increases are. So the orange tape corresponds to, where the orange marker is up to the green marker, and then the green highlight tape is the part between those two green markers. So these are just quick visual things that help me orient myself, particularly if I put this down, halfway through a round, just so I can keep track of where I am. Now I'm at the point where I don't need these as much, but I'm just moving them up periodically just to help remind myself of where I am. It's just a quick reminder. In other situations where I'm not keeping track of something like these panels, I use these locking stitch markers to help me count rows. So if I'm doing just a ton of stockinette, I don't need a chart to remind me, of what row I'm on. I will use them to mark off 10-row increments. So I'll have a marker, and so when I've worked 10 rows, I'll put like one of these turquoise markers, and then another 10 rows, I'll put another one. And then when I get to 25, I'll do the other color. So then I can start reusing these. So I know that's 25, and when I get to 30, I'll move the blue marker up to the 30, and then 40, and then when I get to 50, I'll do another orange one. So I can keep reusing the blue markers, and I can mark my 25 round increments, but keeping track every 10, sometimes 5 rounds. So I use these kind of markers for lots of different things. Sometimes it's to mark these vertical panels, and sometimes it's to keep track of actual rounds. I don't need to keep track of my rounds on the fabric here because I am using this chart and I've got my row counts here, so I know when I'm supposed to do things. So it just depends on the project, which strategy I'm using. I have some other markers on here. Let me get closer. I have some light bulb markers on here as well. I've got a red one right here and a yellow one here. And what I use those for is when it's time to do an increase round or a decrease round, I'm doing the first one at the beginning of the round. So I'm looking at my chart, I know it's an increase round. By the time I get to the middle of the round or the end of the round, I may forget. And so when I'm doing an increase round, after I've done that first increase, I'll move this marker right under the needle so that I remember when I get to the end of the round, oh, you got to do your increase. And likewise, when I've done that first increase, I'll move this marker right up to the very top. These are so tiny, I can even clip the stitches together. So it's like there's no way I can knit past that without having to deal with this marker. So these are things I just do in self-defense, knowing the kinds of mistakes that I tend to make and what a pain it is sometimes to have to fix those. If you go too long before realizing that you've made that mistake, you can't always just ladder down a section and add multiple increases as you go up. You might be able to get away with it if you forgot one increase a couple of rounds ago. Otherwise, you end up having to rip things back. And I want to avoid ripping things back at all costs. My two favorite things to knit are sweaters and socks, and I almost always have a sock going on, usually in between projects, sometimes at the same time as other projects. And I really wanted to have something pretty simple to work on when I was at knitting groups, whether they're online knitting groups by Zoom or in person. It's just, I'm a lot more engaged with what's going on around me if I don't have to pay so much attention to my knitting. But I also, at the same time, like something interesting and different in my sock knitting. And that is what I found with the current sock project that I've got going. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you that project. So I just finished the first sock of a pair. This is the sock I'm using when I'm going to knitting groups because most of it is stockinette. I'm just working the round. It's a toe-up sock. I'm typically not a huge fan of toe-up socks. I've, in the past few years, made an effort to really learn toe-up socks and try to find benefits because the stated benefits, like, oh, you can use up all the yarn, or that's only a benefit for certain people in certain circumstances. It's not a universal benefit. Typically isn't for me in most cases. I like to look for some kind of unique construction that I haven't seen in cuff down, and then when I really examine it, will think that this would be tricky to do cuff down. It would be much more difficult. This is called Tipsy Toes, and it has what we would think of as a wedge toe, you know, straight across here, and then you have the angles here. This is actually more of a curve on this side, the angle, definitely an angle there, but it's replicating a wedge toe. But it obviously is a little tipped over. So what you do is right here is where the cast on is. So that's like a closed cast on, like Judy's Magic cast on. You can use Turkish cast on or figure eight, whichever. You cast on here, and then you increase in order to create this straight edge here and the straight edge here, but you're increasing at different rates. And then when you're done with the increases, you start doing short row shaping so that you get these wedges in order to finish that turn, because you've got the length you need from right here, but you need to get the additional length over here since you've started angled off here. I have a little marker here where the short row shaping ended, and I started doing the foot, and I just have different markers that show me those different kinds of things. And then I think this is where I started gusset shaping. So I cannot wear a short row heel unless I do modifications to increase its size, because I have a very high instep and this diagonal on my foot from the heel across where the leg turns into the foot is really long, especially in relation to the circumference of my leg and foot. So what I need to do is increase the number of stitches that I have for the sole before I start working a short row heel, or even a plain heel or peasant heel, any of those kinds of heels that have the same shape as a short row heel. I need to have more stitches. So I started out with 64 stitches on the needle, and I increased by 4 stitches on each half of the round, or each half of the sock, so that I had an extra 8 stitches for the sole. So now I had 40 stitches for the sole, and then I worked my short row heel until I had the 12 stitches I would have had if I'd started with 32, because you usually do your short rows until you have about a third of the stitches in the center that are just worked every single row. So that gave me extra length here. It also gives me extra circumference room, as does the additional stitches. That all creates additional room for me. And then when I got done, because my leg and foot had the same circumference, I need the same circumference for both of those, I then did decreases every other round until it was back down to my original stitch count. So if you are a person who has a larger foot than ankle, you could do the same thing, where maybe you start out with the number of stitches you need for your foot, but then on your leg you might decrease down a little bit so that it fits snugger, or the reverse, depending, like if your foot is smaller in circumference than your leg, and it just depends on which direction you're working as well. But you can work a short row heel that has a different number of stitches for the leg and the foot. I do have videos on this, on how to make these kind of modifications, because I could never wear peasant heels or short row heels until I figured out how, what the math was, instead of just trying to guess a few extra stitches, because different people are going to need different amounts of additional room. And I needed quite a bit. So then the leg is just straight up. The bind off that I like to use for toe up socks, because a standard chain bind off isn't going to work. There are a lot of different, stretchy bind offs you could do. Typically, some type of sewn bind off is going to give you enough stretch, or you can do some kind of a modified chain bind off where you are adding yarn as you're binding off, so that it essentially creates a larger circumference at the top. I like, when I'm knitting cuff down, I use a long tail cast on. So when I knit toe up, I want an edge that looks the same. So I use a bind off called the half hitch bind off. It's also known as outline stitch bind off, stem stitch bind off. Elizabeth Zimmerman called it casting on, cast off. I use the method from Principles of Knitting by June Hemmons Hyatt, rather than Elizabeth Zimmerman's method, because the method in Hyatt's book is easier. And I have a video on that, so I'll leave a link down below. But it makes it nice and stretchy. And because I have that really long heel diagonal, that circumference on my foot is larger than any other part that the sock has to go past. So it's really important to me that this edge be stretchy, because my heel diagonal is bigger around than my leg circumference is where this is going to be sitting. So I really need a stretchy bind off in this kind of situation. So I'll be starting the second sock very soon, maybe this weekend. I like, because I want to use this for knitting group, I need to get this part done before I go to knitting group, because this is the part where I really have to pay attention. So it does, if you want, right and left feet, then what you do on this is, after you started out exactly the same, and then, but instead on the second one, instead of putting the heel on this part of the sock, I will put the heel on this part. So you just do it on the other half of the round from what you did it in the first sock. So I'll be getting that started, and it shouldn't take me too long to finish this up in between other things and going to different knitting groups. So the next sock project I will likely be working on will be something from my longer term project to understand the evolution of socks and stockings. I've been knitting different stockings from different centuries to kind of understand how the construction and techniques evolved, at least in Western Europe, for knitted stockings. And I have something in mind that goes way further back than that, and that is a sock made using a technique that predates knitting and crochet by quite a lot, called null binding. I took a class this past fall, and I did talk to the teacher about socks and how to go about doing that. I've got some different constructions I've been looking at. So that will be something I will be doing in 2024 at some point, probably not right at the very beginning, because I really need to be able to ramp up my skills before I tackle the sock for that. But that is something that I want to include in this project. The other sock that I really am excited about working on is one from the 1950s. There are a number of socks from the 1950s that I want to tackle that have interesting construction methods. 40s and 50s were like the heyday of sock knitting. There's some really fascinating techniques and approaches to knitting socks that I want to try out. So that's what's coming on the horizon in terms of sock knitting once I get these crazy tipsy toe socks completed. Several of the projects that I have on the needles and just getting off the needles all have to do with sort of Minnesota winter survival, in particular going on our evening walks after dinner. We've been really lucky that it hasn't gotten too cold yet, and it doesn't even really feel like winter has begun. It still feels like fall, except for the fact that it's so dark. One of the other projects that I started when I was started the zipper neck was a pair of gloves. A pair of liner gloves that will be worn under a pair of mittens that will be knit in a strand of colorwork. So it will be 2 layers of knitting, and one of those colors will be kiviot, so that'll be even warmer. And these will be gauntlet mittens that come over the cuff of my coat and hopefully keep things warm. We'll see. I, in the past, have experienced that knitted mittens weren't really warm enough for a Minnesota climate, unless you were just going, from the house to the car. And so this is an experiment to see how warm this can actually be if I have a pair of wool gloves and a pair of wool mittens that are double layer and with kiviot, like if those are actually warm enough. If they're not, we've got hand warmers that we can put inside mittens in order to add even more warmth on our walks. So this is an experiment. The liner gloves I started and I was really close to finishing, and then I ran into some trouble. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you what I mean. So this is the last project that I want that's in progress. And the only reason it's still in progress is because it's in a timeout. I started knitting these a few weeks ago. The first one went really fast. Knitting it, I hadn't knit gloves in a long time, and I was trying to decide exactly how I wanted it to fit. I decided the first one was a little looser across the hand than I'd really like, and so I adjusted my stitch counts and how I was going to do it, the fingers and everything. And this one is fitting much better. I got the thumb done, and then I got the little finger done, and then I realized I had placed the little finger in the wrong spot. So I do have the thumb positioned on the palm, so I always position it in about 1/2 inch from the edge instead of sticking straight out. With mittens anyway, when I put my hand in with the thumb, it rotates the hand a little bit this way. The thumb is going to pull everything this way. So as long as you don't have any sort of like cable pattern or some kind of patterning that you want centered on the back, it's okay to stick the thumb directly out of the middle of the round. But if you have something that you want centered, the palm is done differently than the back of the hand, when you put your hand in and it rotates around, if you put the thumb like 1/2 inch, in on the second half of the round, then everything will stay nice. And so I naturally was doing that with my gloves. I put my gloves there because then, the fingers will all, the thumb will be on the palm part and then everything will be lined up. But somehow I screwed up my pinky finger, and I think I used all of the stitches for the pinky from 1/2 of the round instead of using 1/2 of them from 1/2 of the round and 1/2 from the other. And I didn't realize it till I finished the pinky and was getting ready to do the next one. I'm like, why are my stitch counts so weird? So I put it in a timeout. It will be coming out very soon. So now that I've got zipper neck pretty much done. I just have to find a new zipper. I can work on this a little bit once I rip out the finger. This is why it's good to have multiple projects, because sometimes projects don't behave and they need to sit in a corner for a while. Recently, I got rid of a bunch of stash yarn, like a kitchen garbage bag full of stash yarn that had been on my shelves for a few years. I really wasn't excited about it. Couldn't see myself turning it into anything. I wanted to get rid of it. And so when I was packaging it up, I would put things that went together. Like if I had 3 or 4 bottles of the same thing, I'd put it in a Ziploc bag and inside the garbage bag, so that when the guild member who deals with all this got it, she knew what was what. I used up all my Ziploc bags. Now, I often use Ziploc bags as project bags because in my desk, I have a bin that's, the size of one of these cubes right here, where I keep my works in progress. And I just started like 4 or 5 new things, and they were all in this bin, just mixed together, needles pointing into other balls of yarn, and I had no Ziploc bags to put them in. Did have one drawstring project bag that I often put my sock projects in, and I really like that bag. Otherwise, my project bags tend to be big. They're the ones that I use when I'm going to knitting group or going somewhere and want to take, oh, I finished these 2 things I want to show the group or whatever. I might be bringing multiple things in there. And I want to keep the project actually separated into some kind of drawstring bag. So I thought, I'm going to look up how to make a drawstring bag. So I watched a bunch of videos, and then I found 2 that I really liked. One is like really simple, and then the other one is more complicated. So I didn't want to buy anything. I have some fabric here. I had some twill tape from when I made masks back in 2020, tons of twill tape because I had to buy a whole cone of it. So I made myself a little drawstring bag here, like this, that I can keep like a sock project in. And then I made a fancier drawstring bag that's for like a sweater. I've got all the yarn from my Royale sweater in there. And it's lined. So it's fully lined, and it's got like a box bottom type of thing on it as well. This one, is much fancier, and I like both of them, and I like them for different reasons. It's been really fun to get reacquainted with my sewing machine, because one of my goals for next year is to kind of get back into sewing, and I've signed up for some sewing classes, and I thought, well, this would be a good way to kind of get me back into sewing on my machine, getting used to it again, and thinking about the kinds of things that I might want to make on my sewing machine. So let's go back to the overhead one more time, and I'll show you up close kind of the features of these different drawstring bags. This is the big project bag that I made. It's got, I don't know what you call this, like a box fold or whatever at the bottom, so that it's got an actual bottom to it. So I made this for my big project. So I've got my Royale sweater project in here, all the extra yarn. That's all in here. It's fully lined, which I really liked. So this is kind of the fanciest of all of the boxes. Now, the one thing I didn't like about this, I'll leave a link to the video where I learned how to do this. The one thing that I didn't like was she was suggesting that the channel that you're making for your ribbons or whatever that you're going to use for your drawstring, that you make it barely bigger than the drawstring itself. So like if it's 1/4 of an inch, then you just make it like a 3/8 of an inch or something like that. And so I did that, and I have some, just some twill tape that I had in my stash from making masks a few years ago. And you have to run one tape all the way across, around, and back here, and then you run the second one, you insert it from this end all the way around, and so that way when you pull on the 2 of them, that's the drawstring. The problem is that you've got 2 layers of this twill tape in there, and it's such a narrow casing. I just feel like I would have made it a little wider. So if I make another one of these, like a smaller one, I will make that channel wider. I made another bag that's very simple. Again, if I can even remember where I learned this, I will put this in below. This one is not lined. This one is a lot simpler. I had a long piece of fabric. You could use two that you sewed at the bottom, but there's no box pleat or whatever that's called at the bottom. And it's got a, an 1.5 inch wide channel for the drawstrings, regardless of how narrow or thick your drawstrings are. And it's just so easy to pull it shut. And then it's easy to open up. It doesn't fall open on its own. But it's easy to open up. Whereas the other one that I did, it takes more force to kind of pull it closed and also to open it up. So it works, but I would do it differently next time. And I might make a couple more smaller ones. Probably not with the box thing at the bottom. I think that was really good for this particular one to have that bottom. And I do like something lined, particularly if the fabric is a little thinner. So this is fat quarters that I used, a couple of fat quarters that were identical for the outside and also 2 fat quarters for the inside. Whereas this is like this batik fabric that's just thicker. So this worked out really well for a single layer of fabric, and also it's for a small project. You don't need it to be really as sturdy as I needed for the other one. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next year.